Child abuse is never okay, but you're not a survivor if you get lightly spanked or slapped, and quite frankly you need to grow a pair. When I hear child abuse I usually think of molestation or like beating up your children. I have seen people say they were victims just because they were slapped or their parents called them a fucking asshole, and that's just cringe to me. Define lightly slapped. Like slapped in a way that doesn't leave a mark. Understandable, some people are looking for attention, especially if they are broadcasting the fact that they were abused as a child. But also you never know what someone has actually been through and the way that trauma still affects their lives, but I don't think that many people who have been through serious abuse will openly discuss this to others in casual conversations. Molestation and severe beatings are by no means the full extent of child abuse. Some children grow up in a home where their parents never lifted a finger to harm them physically, but endured years of verbal and emotional abuse, which is just as damaging, if not more so. Additionally, there's a big difference between calling your child an asshole once in a moment of anger, and telling your child what a piece of shit they are on a daily basis for merely existing. I enjoyed the trifecta growing up, but that doesn't make my partner any less of a victim because in his home he only got verbally abused. Abuse isn't the kind of thing that should be thrown around for some asspats, and it's just morally repugnant to pretend to be a survivor of childhood abuse. Nevertheless, it's not really for you to judge what a sufficient amount of abuse is. To be honest, most people I know either joke it off/laugh at the abuse or only share that information privately with people they trust to be safe, and based on your post, I don't think you would qualify. You never know how bad things really could have been behind the scenes, and no one is obligated to divulge that information to you in an effort to prove that it was sufficiently abusive. Slapping a child is physical abuse. Calling a child names and using profanity directed at their person is abusive behavior. Your friends/acquaintances told you they got slapped around or verbally assaulted at home, and your response is that their perception of their childhood abuse is too cringe for you to handle? They need better friends, and you need some compassion. This is tricky since under context this can certainly be abuse, especially if tied with emotional abuse. That being said, getting a light slap in response to bad behavior alone is not abuse by any means. Again, context could change it, but that's besides the point, I guess. Where would you put emotional abuse, gaslighting/manipulation/controlling, etc.? There's also verbal abuse. Psychological abuse is still abuse, winky. Some people can be extremely emotionally/psychologically/verbally abused, and being slapped is scary in those situations. I don't think it's okay to hit a child, and I never would, but if it's a one-off thing then it's not abuse, but it's certainly not okay and should never be accepted ever again. Emotional abuse is a huge part that people leave out, and many parents unintentionally do it. And don't gatekeep child abuse. Their parents called them a fucking asshole. It seems like here you're implying that emotional abuse is not abuse. If you're not and I'm mistaken, then I apologize. If that is what you were trying to imply though, I do have a few questions. Do you really believe that growing up in a hostile home doesn't seriously mess people up, or that being unloved, mistreated, unappreciated, threatened, manipulated, and used doesn't have an effect on a developing mind? Just because it's not rape or beating them half to death doesn't mean it isn't abuse. You can go ahead and think it only counts when someone's brutally molested or covered in bruises and cuts, but that doesn't help the kid that ends up suicidal at age 12 because he's grown up in a broken family ever since he can remember. Is lightly spanking/tapping abuse? No, it's not, unless it's done out of anger and done too hard. You shouldn't bruise your kids, period. Is being roared at in anger to the point where you fear for your life and being manipulated/treated like an object for someone else's satisfaction abuse? Yes, and it's terrible. The mentality of, well, at least you weren't brutally beaten/raped helps absolutely no one. Psychological/emotional abuse is already terribly overlooked and minimized, probably at least in part because mental health isn't taken very seriously a lot of the time. And here's my point. When I hear child abuse I usually think of molestation or like beating up your children. Yeah, most people think of that. It's the first thing that comes to mind when abuse is mentioned, because it's so horrific and often extreme. We hear about it on the news, and it gets a lot more attention often because it has legal implications. Thus we end up with a mentality of if it's not physical/sexual, then it doesn't count, that is, until the kid's found dead on the floor from an overdose or slit wrists. Then, suddenly, it matters. Again, if I misunderstood, I apologize. I don't believe that loving parents who discipline their children are abusive, and I've seen a few people, only a few though, really, so I don't really see what your argument is with this post anyway. Try to claim they've been abused for attention, i.e. Parents called me a fucking asshole one time. Light, asterisk spanking or slapping in discipline or just as a quick hey don't do that when they're young and can't really be reasoned with is fairly harmless. You weren't abused if you grew up in an otherwise happy home and got yelled at once. But emotional and psychological abuse is most certainly abuse, and deserves to be recognized just as much as the other two, especially considering that they often overlap. I agree, but that isn't how you treat any child. No, you're not a survivor, but it still leaves lasting psychological damage. This isn't the time to say grow a pair to anyone. The big difference here is the damage results vary from depression to outright murderous urges. Anything like spanking or light slapping or yelling can do almost anything to their psyche and their mindset. Sorry for any formatting or grammar issues, my phone is being a snail right now.